The morning air at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne was sterile and cold, carrying the faint, clinical scent of disinfectant that seemed to settle deep within my chest. I sat in the wheelchair near the main entrance, my hands clutching a small, transparent plastic bag that contained my entire existence, a wallet, a set of keys, and a faded photograph of Martha, my late wife. The surgical incision running down the center of my sternum throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a constant reminder that only 4 days ago, the surgeons had sawed through my ribs to repair a valve that had sustained me for 7 decades. Every breath was a labor. Every involuntary movement sent a sharp, electric shock radiating through my frame. I stared at the clock mounted on the lobby wall. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The foyer was a theater of human connection. A young woman rushing to greet her husband with a get-well-soon balloon, a teenager gently guiding his frail grandfather toward a waiting car, the old man's walker clattering rhythmically against the floor. I observed these vignettes of devotion with a growing sense of detachment, tightening my grip on my phone. The Bennett family group chat, once a vibrant digital hearth where Martha used to share recipes and scripture, had been dormant for months, save for my own periodic, ignored updates. I typed the message slowly, my fingers thick and callous from 40 years of turning wrenches in my Dandenong workshop. The doctor has cleared me for discharge. Can anyone pick me up? I am at the main entrance. I hit send. The message was marked as delivered instantly, then shifted to read. I waited. 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. The throb in my chest intensified, echoing the mounting tension in my blood. I watched the screen, observing the 3 bubbles that indicated someone was typing. Then they vanished. They reappeared, then vanished again. Finally, a single message from Liam popped up. Dad, call an Uber. The footy quarter is almost over and the score is tied. I cannot leave right now. I lowered the phone, the screen still glowing in my lap. Liam was 32 years old, my only son. I had funded his university tuition by working double shifts until my hands were permanently stained with oil, and I had consistently bailed him out of financial missteps. He and his wife, Sophie, were currently living in a house Martha and I had purchased in 1985, a house we had renovated with our own hands, brick by brick. They were enjoying the high-speed internet I paid for and the comfort of a home that was legally mine, yet they could not spare 20 minutes to retrieve the man who had given them everything. Before I could process the cold finality of his rejection, another message arrived from Sophie. Honestly, Arthur, maybe you should ask the doctors to keep you another week. The house has been so peaceful without that hacking cough of yours keeping us up. We are finally getting some sleep. Just take a taxi. I stared at the words, the blur of the lobby traffic fading into a singular, sharp focus. They did not view me as a father or a relative. I was an inconvenience, a broken piece of furniture that made too much noise. A nurse, young and possessing a warmth that Sophie had never displayed, approached the wheelchair. She looked at my lap, where the phone screen was fading, and her expression softened with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "Is your ride delayed, Mr. Bennett?" she asked gently. I cleared my throat, forcing the internal bitterness into silence. "Something like that," I rasped. "We can arrange medical transport, sir. It might take a few hours, but we will get you home." "No," I said, my voice firmer than my physical condition should have allowed. "I do not need charity." I pushed myself up from a chair. The pain in my sternum was blinding, a hot knife twisting in my core, but I gritted my teeth, refusing to collapse. I would not let them win by witnessing my frailty. I walked toward the sliding glass doors, my back straight, clutching my plastic bag like a suit of armor, stepping out into the Melbourne afternoon to navigate the remainder of my life alone. The taxi ride back to my home in the leafy suburbs of Melbourne felt like a slow procession toward a grave I had not yet entered. Outside the window, the familiar streets blurred into a smear of gray asphalt and manicured green lawns, yet everything felt alien. The driver, a kind man named Ollie with deep, weary eyes, kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, his concern manifesting in the gentle way he navigated every bump in the road. He had offered me more human decency in 20 minutes than my own flesh and blood had provided in half a decade. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house stood before me, a two-story brick colonial that Martha and I had spent 30 years paying off. It was a monument to a life of labor, but as I stood on the curb, the warmth I once associated with it had vanished. I inserted my key into the lock, expecting the familiar resistance of the old mechanism, but the key would not turn. I frowned, pulling it back to check for debris, but the cylinder remained immovable. I stepped back, and my heart sank as I realized I had replaced the traditional hardware with a sleek, digital smart lock, a silent proclamation that the sanctuary I had built was now under new management. I hammered the brass knocker against the wood, the sound echoing hollowly through the house. I knew they were inside. The blue, rhythmic flicker of the television emanated from behind the curtains, casting a ghostly light onto the porch. 5 minutes of silence elapsed before the light finally flicked on, blinding me for an instant. The door swung open, but only halfway, revealing Sophie framed in the threshold. She was draped in a silk robe, an indulgence that seemed jarringly out of place given the history of the house, and she held a glass of white wine with the nonchalance of a guest in a hotel. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning my rumpled clothes and the hospital bracelet still clinging to my wrist with a mixture of annoyance and calculated distance. "You are creating a great deal of noise, Arthur," she said, her voice thin and abrasive. "The neighbors will notice. You changed the locks." I replied, my voice raspy and thin, struggling to maintain a semblance of composure against the sharp, biting wind. "We had to," she replied, her eyes not once meeting my own. "Security concerns. It is a necessary precaution in this neighborhood. We intended to provide you with the code later. We did not anticipate your return this soon." She did not step aside to let me in. She stood there, a gatekeeper of my own property, treating my return as an intrusion. I pushed past her, my movements deliberate despite the blinding fire in my chest. Inside, the house felt fundamentally altered. The faint, comforting scent of Martha's lemon oil and thyme had been completely eradicated, replaced by a suffocating, heavy musk of designer vanilla candles. My favorite leather recliner, the one that had molded to my spine over decades, was nowhere to be found. In its place stood a trendy, angular accent chair that looked as fragile as Liam's work ethic. Liam was sprawled across the main sofa, his feet propped up on the table, eyes glued to the massive television screen. He did not rise, nor did he acknowledge my presence. "Hey, Dad," he grunted, barely shifting his gaze. "You made it." I looked toward the staircase, my sanctuary, the master bedroom where I had held Martha until her final breath. Sophie stepped in front of me, her expression hardening. "We decided to repurpose the master suite while you were hospitalized, Arthur. It is now a studio for my yoga practice. We moved your things to the basement suite. It is private, quiet, and far better for your recovery. The basement, the damp, dark cellar where we stored winter coats and holiday remnants." I realized then that they were not just ignoring me. They were systematically erasing me. As I turned toward the cold, concrete stairs, I felt the last lingering threads of my tolerance snap. I wasn't just a guest in their house. I was a prisoner in my own life, and the time for passivity had definitively expired. I descended into the dark, knowing that while they celebrated their perceived victory upstairs, I was already beginning to weave the trap that would eventually ensure their ruin. The descent into the basement felt like a final surrender to a life I no longer recognized. The air was heavy with the smell of damp concrete and the stale, lingering scent of mothballs from stored winter coats. My makeshift bedroom was a deflated air mattress cast into the corner of a utility room, a humiliating contrast to the life of comfort I had funded for Liam and Sophie. Every time my chest rose and fell, the stitches in my sternum pulled, a sharp, stinging reminder of the vulnerability I was forced to endure. I lay there in the dark, the silence of the basement only broken by the distant, muffled sounds of the television upstairs, where my own son was likely laughing at a show I had paid for with my retirement. The next morning, The hunger was a hollow ache, but the pride I had nurtured over decades of honest labor was far more famished. I needed water, and I needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of that cellar, even if just for a short time. I climbed the stairs, my legs trembling with weakness, and stepped out into the humid Melbourne morning. The neighborhood was quiet, the suburban streets lined with eucalyptus trees that swayed listlessly in the wind. I walked until I reached the local newsagent on the corner of the block, the same shop where I had purchased papers every morning for 20 years. The bell jingled as I pushed open the door. The clerk, a man who had known me since I was a struggling young father, looked up with a kind smile that faded when he saw my haggard appearance and the hospital bracelet still clinging to my wrist. "Arthur, you look like you've been through the wars, mate. Are you all right?" "Just tired, Sam," I replied, my voice a dry rasp. "Just tired." My eyes drifted to the lottery terminal behind the counter. It was a mundane sight, a machine that dispensed dreams to the desperate. I remembered Martha's ritual. She had a system, a sequence of numbers born from our anniversary and the dates of our children's births. She had always played with a light heart, believing that the act of participating was a testament to the hope we had carried through the lean years. I hadn't played in years, but standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of the family I had tried to build, the urge felt less like a gamble and more like a conversation with the past. "Give me a Powerball ticket," I said, placing a $20 note on the counter. Let the machine pick the numbers. The machine whirred, spitting out the small, insignificant slip of paper with a sharp, mechanical sound. I pocketed it without looking, feeling a strange, hollow comfort in the weight of it. It felt like a small act of rebellion, a private gesture toward the woman who had believed in the impossible. I bought a bottle of water and a packet of aspirin, the plastic wrapping crinkling in my hand as I made my way back toward the house. I did not know it then, but that slip of paper was the catalyst for the entire structural collapse of Liam and Sophie's world. When I checked the numbers that evening, the reality was so absurd, so disproportionate to the misery I was currently living that I actually laughed until I started to cough. I had won $80 million. The sheer magnitude of the wealth was enough to buy a city, yet it felt like a cosmic punchline delivered to a man who had been told he was too old to be useful. I tucked the ticket deep into my breast pocket, pressing it against my scar. They were sitting upstairs right now, planning how to exile me to a state-funded facility, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted irrevocably. The game had changed, and for the first time since my surgery, the power had finally migrated back into my hands. The weight of the lottery ticket in my pocket felt like a dangerous secret, a silent explosive that could shatter the walls of my suburban home if handled with anything less than absolute precision. I spent the remainder of the night in the shadows of the utility room, my mind operating with a clarity I had not experienced since my days managing high-stakes logistics for the firm. I knew that if I simply cashed the ticket, Liam and Sophie would immediately sense a shift in the tectonic plates of their existence. Their greed was a constant, predictable variable, and their first instinct would be to petition for guardianship, claiming that the shock of the wind had rendered me incompetent. I needed professional counsel, a man whose moral compass was as refined as his knowledge of trust law. I contacted Steinberg, a solicitor whose office in Toorak had served as the bastion of my financial planning for 3 decades. We arranged to meet in the early hours of the morning at a diner in the city, a place where the steam of the coffee machines masked the quiet negotiations of the desperate and the wealthy alike. Steinberg listened to my account with an expression that transitioned from professional concern to a cold, calculated hunger for justice. He did not ask how I had survived the betrayal. He asked only what I required to dismantle it. "If you claim this prize as an individual, Arthur, you will lose the house before the check clears," Steinberg advised, his voice measured and sharp. "They will argue that your physical and mental state, post-surgery, necessitates immediate legal oversight. We must structure the claim through a blind trust, the Bennett Family Trust. But to be effective and evade the scrutiny of your son's legal team, the trust requires an immediate capitalization of assets." "I want them to sign the house over," I said, my voice steady, feeling the cold steel of resolve deep in my chest. I want them to believe they're trading their current ownership for a share in the 80 million. They are so consumed by the prospect of the fortune that they will not stop to read the fine print. It is a dangerous game, Steinberg warned, adjusting his glasses. You're asking me to draft documents that essentially trick them into a voluntary eviction. If they find out you're using the lottery winnings as a bait, they will retaliate with everything they have. They have already taken everything they could from me, I replied. Now I'm simply facilitating their own undoing. We spent hours drafting the legal architecture. I would play the part of the confused, aging father, fragile and pliable, desperate to protect his family from the perceived threat of inheritance taxes and distant relatives. It was a role I rehearsed until it felt like a second skin. I realized that my previous passivity had been my greatest failure. I had allowed them to believe I was a static object in their path, rather than a force that could shift. As I left the diner, the Melbourne morning was bright and indifferent. I walked back toward the suburb, the city grid feeling like a chessboard where I had finally maneuvered my pieces into position. I was no longer the broken man from the basement. I was the architect of their displacement. The trust was prepared. The documents were drafted with enough ambiguity to seduce their greed, and the stage was set. I walked into the house on the quiet street, hearing Liam and Sophie's voices upstairs, voices that were still planning for a future that was unbeknownst to them, already being sold out from under their feet. I reached the basement door, took a final, steadying breath, and prepared to play the most important role of my life. The days that followed were an agonizing masterclass in deception. I had to inhabit the role of Arthur Bennett, the fragile, fading mechanic, with such conviction that Liam and Sophie would never suspect the iron resolve beneath my skin. I spent my hours in the damp basement, listening to the muffled rhythm of their lives upstairs. Every time I heard their footsteps, I would deliberately slow my own pace, allowing my gait to stutter and my breathing to become labored, a performance designed to reassure them that my decline was inevitable. I watched them through the discreet lens of the surveillance system Dante had installed, a setup that rendered their private lives transparent. They no longer felt the need to maintain the pretense of a loving family. The house, once a warm repository of Martha's life and our shared history, had become a frantic, hollow stage for their avarice. Sharon and Liam were no longer looking for sentimental keepsakes. They were scouring the property for any sign of hidden liquidity, their movements jagged and destructive. I witnessed them tear apart the bookshelves in the study, tossing cherished volumes aside with the careless disdain of people who saw no value beyond the immediate. One evening, I watched from the monitors as Liam paced the living room, his face flushed with the kind of impatient frustration that precedes a violent outburst. "He is lingering, Sophie," he muttered, pouring himself a drink from my private reserve. "The doctor suggested he would be failing faster than this. If he doesn't sign the estate over before the quarter ends, we will be forced to wait. For probate. I cannot wait that long." Sophie, draped across the sofa with a glass of wine in hand, laughed, a cold, brittle sound that echoed through the feed. "He has already gone in every way that matters, Liam. He is just a shell waiting to be emptied. If he doesn't cooperate by the weekend, we will take him to that state-funded facility on the border. They don't ask questions about patient autonomy there. We will have the house empty and the locks changed by Monday." My grip on the edge of the air mattress tightened until my knuckles blanched. I had spent a lifetime protecting them, shielding them from the consequences of their choices, only to find that my presence was the ultimate obstacle to their imagined paradise. I realized then that I had not been living with a family. I had been hosting a slow-motion invasion. Every piece of advice I had ever given, every sacrifice I had made, had been viewed by them as a weakness to be exploited. Dante's voice crackled through the earpiece, grounding me. "They are planning to finalize the transfer of your power of attorney tomorrow, Arthur. They think they have you cornered. They think they have me cornered because they believe the only value I have is what they can extract from me," I whispered, my voice devoid of tremor. I stared at the screen, watching Liam mock the way I used my cane to navigate the stairs. They were so intoxicated by their anticipation of wealth that they had become blind to the reality of their own situation. They were counting the coins in a treasure chest that had already been emptied. I watched them toast to my impending departure, oblivious to the fact that their actions were being archived for the final act. They were meticulously documenting their own treachery, providing me with all the leverage required to dismantle them entirely. As the lights finally went out upstairs, I allowed myself a brief, mirthless smile. They want a ghost? They would soon have one. They were ready to discard me to the state, and I was more than ready to ensure that when they finally reached for the prize, they would find nothing but the cold, hard weight of their own ruin. I lay back in the dark, the rhythm of my heart finally steady, and closed my eyes, not in sleep, but in preparation. The stage was finally set for the dismantling of their world. The illusion of their impending windfall began to fracture against the cold, unyielding reality of the financial constraints I had quietly orchestrated. From my observation point in the South Bank office, I watched the walls of their stolen paradise start to buckle under the weight of their own manufactured desperation. I had spent years diversifying my holdings into complex, multi-layered trusts, specifically designed to trigger a liquidity freeze the moment my status was formally updated in the government's probate system. The transition had been seamless. I watched on the monitor as Liam attempted to use the supplementary credit card I had provided for household expenses at a high-end boutique in Collins Street. Sophie was beside him, pointing toward diamond-encrusted watches, her expression one of practiced, haughty expectation. The clerk swiped the card with a professional smile, but the machine emitted a sharp, dissonant tone, a sound that seemed to puncture the very air of the room. Liam's frustration was instantaneous and visceral. He gestured aggressively, his face flushing a mottled, angry red, clearly insisting that the bank had made a catastrophic error. The clerk tried a second time, then a third, her smile fading into a mask of polite embarrassment. Finally, the manager intervened, his expression shifting from service-oriented grace to firm, professional detachment. He did not return the card. Instead, he produced a small pair of shears and severed the plastic into useless shards before their eyes. The public humiliation was absolute. They stood in the center of the showroom, the weight of 100 judging eyes bearing down on them, their aura of unearned entitlement evaporating into the conditioned air. When they returned to the house in the suburbs, the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to frantic. They were no longer the victors of an inheritance. They were fugitives from a system that had suddenly slammed its doors shut. I watched through the internal cameras as they paced the living room, their voices rising in a discordant symphony of panic. Every single account is frozen. Arthur, Liam roared, throwing his jacket onto the floorboards with a force that sent dust motes dancing in the light. The probate lawyer says the estate is under an indefinite audit by the bank's fraud department. How is this possible? He was a simple mechanic. He did not have the foresight to hide millions. Sophie, who had maintained a veneer of icy control until this moment, finally fractured. She tore through the kitchen cabinets, searching for the emergency cash reserves I had long since relocated. He could not have moved them. He was an old man who didn't even know how to use the online portal. He clearly did. Liam shouted back, his voice thick with the desperation of a man who realized his creditors in the city were not going to be pacified by promises of future wealth. We are sitting in a house we cannot pay for, driving cars that will be repossessed by the end of the week. We have to find where he hid the physical access keys to the offshore trusts. They began to dismantle the house with a feverish, destructive intensity. It was no longer a search for assets. It was an act of violence against the memories contained within those walls. They ripped the molding from the ceiling and tore the carpet from the floorboards, their faces distorted by a raw, unadulterated greed that had finally stripped away the last vestiges of their humanity. Watching them, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They were trapped in a cage of their own design, frantically gnawing at the bars, oblivious to the fact that I was the one who held the only key to their salvation, or their final destruction. The stage was set. The desperation I had meticulously engineered was now driving them toward the final, fatal mistakes I needed them to commit. The clinical silence of the private suite at the hospital was punctuated only by the mechanical, rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor, a sound I had forced my physiology to synchronize with for days. I lay motionless, my skin pale and mapped with the subtle, deliberate bruising applied by the theatrical makeup artist Dante had commissioned. This was my sanctuary of deception, a place where I had become a ghost in my own body, waiting for the inevitable moment when my enemies would be lured into the final chamber of the trap. Through my half-closed eyelids, I watched as the door opened, the air shifting with the heavy, cloying scent of Sophie's perfume, a floral veil that could no longer hide the rot beneath her skin. She entered with a performative air of tragic determination, her hand hovering near the monitors as if she were a devoted daughter-in-law, tending to a fading flame. I kept my breathing shallow, my heart rate steady, ensuring that every tremor of my muscles remained beneath the threshold of detection. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice a carefully curated blend of sorrow and expectation. She leaned in, her lips brushing my ear, but the whisper that followed was like a needle of ice. "Let go, Arthur. You are a hollow shell, a relic of a life that has already moved on. Just stop fighting, so we can stop pretending. The world will be so much lighter when you finally cease to exist." It took every fiber of my being to remain motionless. The rage behind my eyes was a physical pressure, a mounting tide that threatened to shatter my composure. I felt her hand press against my chest, not with the tenderness of a partner, but with the calculated pressure of someone checking to see if the spirit had truly departed. She was looking for a sign, a flickering of the eye or a catch in the breath, that would justify her next step. When I gave her nothing but the steady, monotonous rhythm of the monitor, she exhaled a breath that sounded disturbingly like relief. She moved to the corner of the room, where Liam stood in the shadows, his face a mask of nervous, predatory impatience. They began to whisper, their voices low and sharp, mapping out the final logistics of my transition. They were discussing the power of attorney, the immediate liquidation of the company's shares, and the absolute control they would wield the moment I was legally declared terminal. They truly believed that I was trapped in this state of vegetative imprisonment, that I was a passenger in my own mind, unable to witness the final orchestration of their treachery. As they spoke, the cruelty of their plans crystallized before me. They weren't just planning to inherit. They were planning to erase every trace of my existence, to ensure that the Arthur Bennett they had discarded would be forgotten as swiftly as a broken machine. When they finally retreated, leaving me alone in the sterile quiet, I allowed myself a single, slow blink. The monitors continued their steady, deceptive cadence, but the man they had left behind was not the man they had poisoned. I had been forged in the crucible of their hatred, and the patience I had cultivated was now a weapon. I wasn't just waiting for them to finish their work. I was waiting for them to reach the zenith of their arrogance. The trap was set, the evidence was documented, and the time for the invalid to rise was rapidly approaching. Every word they had spoken, every touch of their hands, was now a permanent part of the case file that would eventually bury them. The time for passivity had ended. I was the architect of their displacement, and the final structural collapse of their world was already underway. The clinical suite felt like a pressure cooker, the air growing thick with the scent of antiseptic and my own simmering rage. I remained a prisoner of my own design, lying prone while the echoes of Liam and Sophie's conversation reverberated in my mind like a funeral dirge. They were finalizing the logistics for the transition, a term they used with chilling, clinical detachment to describe my permanent removal from the business and the life I had built. However, the revelation that pushed me beyond the threshold of patience was their discussion regarding Leo. I had been listening to the audio feed, transmitted through the hidden microphones in the suite. They were no longer focused solely on my estate. They were deliberating on how to dispose of my young son. Liam's voice was devoid of any humanity as he outlined a plan to surrender Leo to the state care system, framing it as a tragic necessity born from Sophie's inability to cope with my supposed vegetative state. They calculated that by distancing themselves from the boy, they would not only remove a witness to their daily indiscretions, but also secure a government stipend for Sophie's emotional distress. The sheer audacity of the betrayal left me breathless. Sophie, the woman I had welcomed into our family, was now treating our son like a discarded inventory item. She spoke of his future with the same cold indifference one might apply to the disposal of industrial waste, suggesting that he be transferred to a facility in a remote region of New South Wales to ensure he would never have to cross their path again. They were not just stealing my empire. They were attempting to liquidate the very heart of my existence. As the door clicked shut behind the departing medical staff, the heavy weight of the charade became almost unbearable. I waited until the floorboards in the hallway stopped creaking, ensuring the coast was clear. I reached under the hospital bed frame, my fingers finding the small, cold edge of the burner phone I had taped there weeks ago. My movements were slow, deliberate, and agonizingly stiff, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins served as a powerful antidote to the exhaustion. I pulled up Dante's contact, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. My heart rate flickered for a fraction of a second, but I forced it back into a steady, rhythmic pattern. The evidence I had gathered, the recordings of their conspiracy, the financial records of their attempted fraud, and now the documented intent to abandon a minor, was more than sufficient to dismantle their world. I typed the message with a focus that bordered on the divine. It was the signal I had promised. The time for observation had definitively passed. There was no longer any room for half measures or the hope that they might eventually experience a shred of conscience. They had chosen to discard the innocent, and in doing so, they had forfeited any claim to leniency. I slipped the phone back into its hiding place and lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. The invalid was finished. The architect of their destruction was ready to take the floor. I closed my eyes, visualizing the sequence of events that would follow, knowing that when I opened them next, the world would finally see the true faces of the people who had dared to call themselves my family. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already here, and I was the one holding the lightning. The heavy front door of my suburban Melbourne home, the sanctuary I had built with decades of honest labor, swung open with a resounding thud that silenced the frantic chaos within. I stepped across the threshold, not as the frail, decaying invalid they had envisioned, but as Arthur Bennett, the unyielding architect of my own legacy. Dante flanked me, moving with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a shadow, sealing the exit behind us. The living room was a scene of calculated devastation. Upholstery shredded, floorboards pried open, and drawers emptied. It was the physical manifestation of Liam and Sophie's ravenous, unfulfilled greed. In the center of the wreckage stood my daughter, Clara, her face pale and streaked with tears, clutching a portfolio of documents. Liam had cornered her, his face twisted into an ugly, unfamiliar snarl of absolute desperation. "You will sign the asset transfer, Clara." Liam spat, his voice dripping with malice, entirely oblivious to the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "Your father is gone, and this empire belongs to us now. Stop being a sentimental fool." "She will not sign anything," I stated. My voice was not a shout, but it possessed a low, commanding resonance that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Liam froze, his hands still suspended aggressively in the air. He turned slowly, his eyes widening to a grotesque degree as they locked onto me. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. Across the room, Sophie dropped a silver decor piece she had been holding. The heavy metal clattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening ring. She backed away until she hit the wall, her hands trembling uncontrollably, staring at me as if she were confronting a specter that had clawed its way out of the grave. "Arthur," Sophie whispered, the word barely escaping her constricted throat. "It cannot be. The doctors said you were terminal." "Doctors provide prognosis, Sophie." "I provide conclusions," I replied, taking a measured step into the room. I did not raise my fists. Physical violence was too crude a tool for this moment. Instead, I brought the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute authority. I looked at my daughter, who was staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and overwhelming relief. "Come here, Clara." She bypassed her brother without a second glance and rushed to my side, burying her face against my shoulder. I held her securely, grounding her against the nightmare she had just awakened to. "You thought you were clever, Liam," I continued, my gaze locking onto my son, who was now visibly shaking. "You thought my wealth was a buffet, and my life was the admission ticket. But you severely underestimated the man who built the table. The accounts are frozen because I commanded it. The offshore trusts are sealed because I designed them to be impenetrable to parasites. Every conversation you had in this house, every pathetic plan you made to discard my young son to the state, I recorded it all." Dante stepped forward, placing a sleek audio device on the ruined coffee table. With the press of a button, Sophie's cold, calculated voice filled the room, discussing her profound disdain for Leo and her impatience for my passing. The undeniable proof hung in the air, a suffocating blanket of truth. Clara gasped, turning to look at the man she had called a brother and the woman he had married, finally recognizing the grotesque monsters hiding beneath their tailored clothes. I watched as the remaining fragments of their arrogance shattered. I did not need to strike them. The psychological dismantling was already complete. They had no money, no leverage, no alibi, and nowhere to run. They were utterly broken, trapped in the inescapable, glaring light of their own malevolence. The air in the living room had become thick with the scent of stagnant dust and the metallic tang of exposed secrets. Liam, stripped of his previous bravado, scrambled backward until he hit the cold marble of the fireplace hearth, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them steady. Beside him, Sophie stood frozen, her eyes darting between Dante's stoic presence and the incriminating evidence spilling from the audio device. She looked small, stripped of the manicured perfection that had defined her presence in our home. The mask of the sophisticated suburban elite had completely melted away, leaving only the raw, shivering reality of a trapped scavenger. "It was a misunderstanding," Liam stammered, his voice rising into an unmanly, frantic pitch as he looked up from the floor. "Sophie. She was the one who pushed for the immediate asset transfers for the medical interventions. I was in debt, Dad. I was being pressured by creditors in the city. You know how the logistics market is in Melbourne right now. One bad quarter, and you are underwater. I didn't want to hurt anyone, least of all Leo." I watched him with a cold, detached curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a specimen undergoing a final, pathetic convulsion. "You are not a victim of the market, Liam. You are a victim of your own insatiable appetite," I said, my voice steady, slicing through his desperate excuses. I walked toward him, each step measured and heavy, forcing him to shrink further into the hearth. "You didn't just want the money, you wanted the power that came with it. You wanted the prestige of the Bennett name, all while conspiring to end my life, isolate Clara, and discard your own younger brother, as if he were an inconvenience." Sophie suddenly lunged forward, her mask of composure dissolving into pure, unadulterated vitriol. "He is right," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Liam. "It was his plan. He brought the fraudulent documents. He made the calls to the creditors. I only went along with it because he convinced me we were drowning financially." Their betrayal of each other was instantaneous, a final, reflexive act of self-preservation that served only to confirm their mutual guilt. I looked at them, two people who had claimed to love me, who had sat at my dinner table, broken bread with me, and discussed their future in my home, and I felt a profound, liberating lack of empathy. They weren't fighting for morality. They were fighting for the sinking remains of their own reputations. "The time for your revisions of history has passed," I said, signaling to Dante. Dante produced a folder, a comprehensive compilation of bank statements, encrypted email logs, and sworn affidavits from the individuals they had attempted to recruit for their fraud. It was a roadmap of their destruction, meticulously documented and ready for the authorities. Liam looked at the folder as if it were a death warrant. He tried to lunge for it, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but Dante merely stepped aside, allowing Liam to collapse onto the floor, a broken figure in his oversized, expensive suit. Clara, standing by my side, reached out and took my hand. Her grip was tight, a silent affirmation that she had finally detached herself from the web they had spun around her. I looked at my daughter and saw not the fragile girl who had been manipulated by Liam's false promises, but a woman who was finally seeing the world with eyes wide open. The monsters were still in the room, but their power had been completely extinguished. Every lie they had whispered, every ounce of malice they had harbored, had led them to this precise, irreversible conclusion. The atmosphere in the house felt lighter, despite the lingering stench of their deceit, as we waited for the final act to commence. The sound of heavy sirens piercing the quiet Melbourne night arrived not as a surprise, but as the inevitable resolution to a long-orchestrated symphony of justice. Within moments, the driveway of the family home was flooded with a harsh, rhythmic strobe of police lights, casting long, frantic shadows against the brick walls of the house. Detective Miller entered the living room with a tactical team, their presence bringing a final, cold sense of order to the wreckage that had become our once peaceful sanctuary. Liam did not even attempt to stand. He remained huddled on the floor by the fireplace, his face buried in his hands, his previous attempts to cast blame on his Sophie now replaced by a hollow, defeated silence. As Miller approached, Liam's posture slumped, his arrogance finally eroded by the raw, shivering reality of a man who realized his future had narrowed down to the dimensions of a prison cell. Miller did not waste time with theatrics. He read the charges with the practiced, monotone efficiency of a man who had cataloged every variation of human betrayal. When the handcuffs finally clicked, a sharp, metallic finality, the sound seemed to echo through the entire house, marking the end of my son's influence over our lives. Sophie was taken shortly after. As the officers led her toward the front door, she made one last attempt to meet my gaze. There was no apology in her eyes, only a lingering, venomous resentment, as if she were the victim of an unfair business transaction rather than a perpetrator of systemic conspiracy. She looked at Clara, then at me, her expression hardening into a mask of cold, brittle hostility. She did not plead for mercy. She simply turned away, the heels of her designer shoes clicking against the hardwood one last time before she was escorted into the night. It was a departure devoid of grace, a fitting end for a woman who had measured her life solely by the weight of her acquisitions. I stood by the window, watching the cruisers exit the property, their lights fading into the distance. Clara moved beside me, her silence eloquent. The house felt cavernous, but for the first time in months, it also felt clean. The residual tension that had permeated the air, the fear that had dictated our every movement, had vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Miller lingered for a moment to finalize the statement, his eyes scanning the room with a weary understanding of the tragedy that had unfolded there. "You have a long road ahead to piece this back together, Arthur," Miller said, his tone softened by a genuine, if brief, empathy. "But the threat is neutralized. You are finally safe." "I'm more than safe," I replied, watching the last of the police vehicles disappear from view. "I am finally awake." After the officers departed, the house fell into a profound, heavy silence. Dante remained briefly to oversee the secure transfer of the remaining documents, his presence as steady and unremarkable as a shadow. When he finally left, the stillness that descended was not the oppressive quiet of a trap, but the peaceful stillness of a sanctuary reclaimed. Clara looked around at the destroyed furniture and the remnants of the life we had once assumed was secure. She didn't weep. She simply walked to the kitchen, opened the window to let the fresh night air purge the stagnant atmosphere, and began to tidy the space. I didn't stop her. The purge was complete. The past was in handcuffs, and for the first time in a decade, the future was an unwritten page that belonged entirely to us. The lakeside air at our retreat in the Dandenong Ranges was a profound balm, a sharp contrast to the suffocating confines of the suburban life we had left behind in Melbourne. 1 year had passed since the night of the purge, a year defined not by the shadow of the past, but by the deliberate, steady rhythm of reconstruction. I stood on the deck as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in hues of bruised violet and burning gold. Behind me, the house was alive with the sounds of a life actually being lived. Leo was laughing, his voice unburdened and clear, as he practiced his football skills on the lawn, and Clara was inside, her presence signaled by the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard as she managed the logistics of our enterprise with a competence that both humbled and amazed me. I had long since ceased to be the mechanic who hid his wealth behind a veneer of simplicity. I had become something else, a father who had been granted a reprieve from his own funeral. The lake house was my monument to that second chance. It wasn't a fortress of high walls and hidden agendas. It was a home built on the radical honesty we had finally earned. I called out, my voice resonant and steady, and within moments, they joined me on the deck. We sat at the patio table, a small, unbreakable circle of survivors. There was no need for grand speeches. The weight of our shared history was a silent, understanding presence. I placed the leather briefcase on the table, the latch clicking with a finality that signaled the end of my final secret. Inside, I had arranged the legal architecture for their futures. I slid a trust document toward Leo and the formal transfer of executive power to Clara. "This is not a reward," I said, looking at them both. "This is the recognition of your own strength. Leo, you were the conscience that kept me from drifting into the dark. Clara, you were the resilience that kept our legacy from being dismantled by the greedy. You earned your freedom long before I handed you these papers." Clara took my hand, her eyes clear and devoid of the fear that had once haunted them. "We aren't just surviving anymore, Dad. We are building something that is actually ours." We spoke of the future, of expansion, of new ventures, and of the quiet, unremarkable joy of a life without traps. The past was a scar, certainly, but it was a scar that served as a reminder of what we had survived. I thought of Liam in his cell, a man whose ambition had become his own cage, and I thought of Sophie, a woman who had traded her soul for a status she could never truly possess. They were ghosts now, irrelevant to the trajectory of our lives. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight, I leaned back, feeling the tension of 40 years finally drain from my shoulders. I was 70 years old, a man who had been poisoned, betrayed, and declared dead, yet I had never felt more vibrant. I raised my glass to the stillness of the lake. We had learned that family is not defined by the blood you share, but by the people who stand beside you when the house is on fire. I had been a fool to believe that peace was something you could buy, but I was a fortunate man to have discovered that true peace is something you have to defend with your very life. I looked at my children, the architects of my new world, and knew that whatever storms might gather on the horizon, we were finally, irrevocably home.